And so I want to introduce myself. My name is Dan Reid. I'm the Senior Environmental Program Manager at the Responsible Business Alliance. It's a coalition of about 170 electronics companies focusing on supply chain issues that range everywhere from ethics and labor and health and safety and environmental conditions within manufacturing supply chains. And we're also starting to take a more active look at reverse supply chains, which of course includes, e-waste recycling and circular economy. For logistics, please use the chat box. I'm sure you're all very used to the logistics of this platform by now, but please use the chat box. And I'll be screening that and can relay some questions when we have time at the end of the presentations to our panelists. This session is being recorded, so it'll be available later. And when you're done, please take the survey at the top when it appears, just so that we can see and get a little bit of feedback on what you thought of this session. So I want to quickly tee up the conversation today with kind of this idea of two major approaches within the electronics industry. And I propose, at least for a framework for the next hour, so this session and the next one, that this is two major kind of approaches that we need to adequately consider if we want to be effective in implementing a circular economy within the electronics industry. The first is that we need a way to responsibly, but also sustainably recycle existing e-wastes. And it says existing just because there's a lot right now, but certainly, recognizing that e-waste, and I realize that that is a very complicated definition over time, but for the sake, again, for simplicity for the next hour, let's just say e-waste is any electronic product that is no longer wanted by its current user. So it could go on to many different pathways, but let's perhaps just use that definition for the next hour. That there is a need to address that type of issue. And then the second approach is a little bit more proactive, but it talks about designing waste out of the system entirely. So how do we use electronics while minimizing waste to begin with? And during this hour, we're going to focus just on this first approach. Responsibly and sustainably recycling e-waste. During the next session that follows this one, we'll be looking at the other approach, which is designing out waste from the system entirely. So for the next half hour, we'll have a case study, a couple of case studies, and some discussions that focus on how to address this. And the reason why this is so important, as I've kind of alluded to already, is that we really can't ignore existing e-waste. There's a lot of it, and we'll have some numbers to look at and kind of consider shortly. But it is something that's already out there, and it poses a lot of opportunities, but also challenges. It presents a lot of significant economic and social and environmental opportunities, a lot of good that can be created from it, but it also poses a lot of challenges that are inherent to the materials themselves, such as the hazards that they pose. And if we don't consider those hazards and only look to the opportunities, that could be really considered an irresponsible business practice. So it kind of does have this dual-edged sword that we really need to look at when we want to try to solve this problem. And so to look at the opportunity itself, there is perhaps a lot of unique opportunities and challenges to electronics that, maybe you can see parallels or connections between other industries that you may have heard from, or that you yourself might be involved in, such as we hear a lot in this conference from apparel and food and ag and consumer goods. And so, electronics themselves are, I would argue, a very, very fundamentally different type of product and material. And there are a lot of opportunities that come with that. For example, secondary markets are more readily available for electronic goods. Electronic goods are themselves usually somewhat expensive or valuable, inherently. And so even if one user doesn't want it, the fact that another might kind of indicates that that product retains a lot of its inherent value as it goes through life. That also allows a lot of opportunities for refurbishment, repair, and things like that. It actually contains quite a lot of high value materials in and of themselves. We're talking about precious metals, rare earth metals, and it's an estimated $57 billion worth of material that's present in e-waste alone. Some of those materials are actually very easily recycled. When we look at minerals themselves, a lot of them can be recycled many times over and have quite a long lifespan. These are all things that, seem very apparent for electronics, but, when comparing this to, say, food and ag, certainly not true in the ag sector. It's very difficult to reuse used food or scrap and things like that. For example, recycling fabrics kind of has its own challenges, and that sometimes isn't always so with electronics. And in some ways, that also presents an opportunity for new sources and supplies of some of those scarce and high-risk minerals. So we can actually take a look at perhaps chips and things like that would have gold or precious metals in them, and that could be a source to replace things like this, open pit mine, and that presents kind of a great environmental opportunity. Perhaps the intangible part of it too is that it provides a really great opportunity for customer expectations. They have this idea that things turn over quickly in the electronics industry, and say expect disruption perhaps a little bit more rapidly or readily than they do in consumer goods. And so the consumer seems to be a little bit more open to the prospect of it. At the same time, it's also a challenge. There is 53 million metric tons of e-waste that were produced in 2019, and it's something that's not going away. It's expected to increase to 74 million metric tons by 2030. This is driven by a lot of different things. Personal consumption of electronics, especially in developing markets, the proliferation of electronics into goods, that they used to not be in. For example, hardware, housewares, clothing, and cars, things like that. If you could think of a driver yourself, this is just a quick overview, but put it in the chat box, and I'd love to kind of get a feedback on what this group sees as kind of a proliferation in this sector. Also very unique. E-waste is potentially very hazardous. It has a lot of complex materials in it. In many cases, it's designed not to be opened. So when it is, opened or dismantled, it does expose potentially some of those materials that were not intended to be exposed to consumers and workers. And so, it does potentially pose some challenges when we're looking to recycle them. And in some cases, it creates a really complex reverse recycling chain that doesn't always mean that it's economically viable. Because as much as there is, say, gold or rare earth metals in there, there's also a lot of materials that people don't want. And I included a picture of, these tube TVs as kind of an example of a glut of electronics that contained quite a bit of precious metals and copper, but also a lot of hazardous materials and leaded glass and things like that make them difficult to recycle. And so for that reason, e-waste requires a lot of very careful handling and strong management. It's not something that can be done casually or easily. And the reason for that is that we need to prevent exposure to those hazardous substances. Proper protective measures need to be taken for the workers or the people handling themselves, but also to make sure that that type of material doesn't inadvertently enter the environment and create, more detrimental impact than what we were trying to prevent by recycling it in the first place. And it's a real challenge, for the industry looking at e-waste. It's kind of this black box where it's difficult to track and to see where e-waste is constantly going, and to making sure that it's coming with good and strong practices. 82% of e-waste is uncollected. All these numbers come from the most recent e-waste monitor that came out a few months ago. So I encourage you to take a look at that document if you haven't, if you're not familiar with it, just to get a grasp on the issue. But 82% is uncollected in and of itself. And, when e-waste comes with kind of this unknown recycling practice or origin to it, it also comes potentially with a lot of dangerous baggage or claims to it. And so, for example, it could be produced, in a way that's socially or environmentally irresponsible. We see this in kind of common reports very frequently. If you Google image search e-waste, the first few page of pictures aren't pleasant ones, right? And so, while we want to prevent that, to make sure that, those types of practices aren't encouraged, because they actually create a quite substantial business risk from the manufacturers and the producers that put those things together. both they want to make sure that they're not encouraging those practices by dumping e-waste into those types of systems. They want to make sure that when they sell or give e-waste to a vendor, that it's going to be processed in responsible ways. But then on the other hand, when something is recycled and it's turned back into a material and they want to procure it, they want to make sure that that material that they're buying and reintegrating into their products is also produced in a socially and environmentally responsible way. I want to also emphasize that these types of practices aren't just in the informal sector, but they're also sometimes present in the formal sector as well. And so it actually creates a lot of expenditure to make sure that those types of practices aren't happening there. And what this comes down to, and I frequently hear from a lot of our companies and members, is that meeting recyclable circular economy goals can't be dependent on these types of practices. We can't sacrifice, say, worker health and safety for the sake of the circular economy. One has to support the other, and there's a lot of opportunity to do that. And so I propose, and this is RBA's approach, that increased due diligence in this sector is one way that we can try to formalize in such a way that practices are traced, material is traced, and we can ensure that good value, economic value, social value, and environmental value is reaching all the parties throughout the entire value chain. We do this in the manufacturing side. RBA has a lot of systems and tools to make sure that worker health and safety and environment is considered in manufacturing. And we're starting to take an approach to apply that to the demanufacturing side as well. And we're taking a look or focusing specifically on data and reporting and standardization to make sure that this information is more readily available, but also looking to make sure that materials are responsibly recycled and procured as a material on the other end just as effectively. So I want to thank you for the time, and please reach out to me either through the chat box or the network capabilities here through this program, or send me an email. But I want to introduce our next speaker, Shelley Zimmer, the Sustainable Impact Manager from HP Inc., to present her slides as well.
Great, thanks, Dan. A lot of people say, what is a sustainable impact manager? What does that mean? And the most tangible way I always explain that is to say, I help customers recycle their print cartridges in 66 countries in the world. Next slide, please. HP's sustainable impact strategy is about planet, people, and community. It's essential to our company's mission to create technology that makes life better for everyone, everywhere. And so we implement that throughout our programs and products. And this is one example of the ways that we bring it to life for customers. Next slide. If you see the top of the screen, you'll see the little shopping cart there. And that's where our closed loop process for print cartridges begins. Customers buy original HP cartridges for their quality and reliability. And when they're done with them, they can recycle them through the HP Planet Partners program. The best way to get started is to go to hp.com/recycle, and there you can see the recycling options available to you in your country. When customers send those cartridges back to us in the next little circle there, we take those cartridges back, we sort them. So ink is in one pile, toner is in another pile, and then those cartridges are further sorted. So similar types are in each specific pile. It enables us to more effectively recycle each one. Then we take those sorted cartridges and we shred them or disassemble them, meaning demanufacture them, so that we separate the materials. So we have plastics now in one pile, we have the metals in another, label material, all of the different pieces and parts of a print cartridge. We take the plastics from those recycled cartridges that customers sent back to us. And in the case of ink cartridges, we combine them with plastic bottles, recycled plastic bottles, or recycled apparel hangers. My colleague Ellen Jakowski spoke on Tuesday about our new way of adding a social impact to this process when she spoke about our partnership with a program in Haiti, where a good proportion of our bottles are now sourced from a program in Haiti, meaning that we are now incorporating ocean-bound plastic into our ink cartridges as a regular practice. In the case of toner cartridges, we combine the recycled cartridge plastic with new plastic. And then in either case, we reformulate the plastic. So we have that whole mixture working together, the plastics and the additives, in order to bring it back up to the quality that HP requires for cartridge manufacturing. And then that material is used in new cartridges again. In some cases, we estimate that some of the plastics in our cartridges have gone through this loop as many as 7 different times. If you move to the next slide, please. You might wonder whether we're doing this, is this just a few cartridges, a few plastic bottles? But we're doing it at scale. Altogether, customers have recycled 875 million HP cartridges since our program began in 1991. We've used more than 4.7 billion plastic bottles in manufacturing new HP cartridges, and 114 million apparel hangers are upcycled into our ink cartridge recycling process. Next slide, please. But we're not stopping there. Our goal is that by the year 2025, 30% of the plastics we use will be recycled materials across all of our products, from supplies to hardware, the printers themselves, as well as our computing products. And we most recently reported in our Sustainable Impact Report that we're at 9%. It's important to know that we're taking the lessons that we started with in our closed loop process for cartridges, and we're applying those lessons and that technology expertise into the other products. And we're going to go real hard to focus on that goal. Next slide. I thought I would offer a few guidelines or suggestions for those of you who are also working to build your circular economy strategies. So here's a couple ideas. First, design products that are recyclable. Design them so that materials can be taken apart and those materials can be easily recycled. Offer options for recycling for customers. And this slide says that we offer recycling in 74 countries and territories in the world. That's actually even grown since I made this slide. It's now 76 for our hardware products. And I mentioned before 66 countries for supplies. We use recycled content in our new products, as I've described. And also, we're now developing service models so that customers are buying the service of printing or the service of computing, and that enables us to make even more improvements to our closed loop process and to our circular economy strategies. Okay, next slide, please. So what can you do? Well, you can go to hp.com/recycle to see the recycling options available to you. You can also learn more about our strategies by going to see our Sustainable Impact Report at hp.com/sustainableimpact. And you can follow us on Twitter at HP Sustainable. All right, thank you. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you, Shelley. So I thought I'd start with our remaining 5 minutes. I'll ask you a question, and then perhaps open it up to our other panelists that are here as well, with a bit more discussion, since we just have a great brain trust. So for Shelley, for you, I mean, that's amazing statistics around the amount of recycled plastic. I mean, to think of not just the plastic from the product itself, but also from ocean-bound plastic or other sources as well. So you can definitely imagine the environmental impact. Can you elaborate a little bit more on maybe how this program in particular has impacted the customer or business relationship that you've had in this space?
Sure. Well, for consumers, a lot of times their entry point for taking steps to improve their environmental footprint is through recycling. And so by offering these easy ways for customers to recycle, we have many options for them between dropping off at some of our authorized retail recycling partners like Staples, Walmart, Best Buy, and Office Depot. That helps them learn that it's easy to recycle. And then what can I do next? What is the next action I can take? For our commercial customers, many of them are working on sustainable procurement goals or waste reduction goals. And by helping them to take this step easily, that helps them know, oh gosh, now I can use my time to do more things.
That's great. I want to pull in, our other speakers too. You may have seen two more faces. We're also joined by Remco from Fairphone and Jordan from Facebook, who will join us in our next session. But thought I'd pull them in a little bit earlier just to also contribute to this kind of conversation around recycling if they have any stories or best practices they want to hear. I mean, what has been your experience in dealing with recycling supply chains, or do you have any major lessons learned from your company's work in the recycling sector?
I'm happy to share Facebook's
Please, yeah.
experience around recycled material supply chain. So, we're increasingly looking for ways to incorporate recycled content into our designs, our plastic parts. Those tips in Shelley's slide, particularly around including recycled content, that's obviously super important to creating a circular product. And it's important too as a brand to create those end markets. So for us, for data center equipment that we build, which I'll speak a little bit more about in our case study later, but we're kind of unique because we're our own customers. And while that frees us of some of the cosmetic requirements, you still need to choose good candidate parts that meet, rigorous mechanical material requirements such as strength and flammability ratings, things that are very important in the data center. But a key lesson that we've learned along the way is to involve our downstreams actually earlier in the process. The folks who will be processing and recycling the material at end of life. And we make a point of sending, the material spec sheets down to our recyclers to make sure they have visibility and can confirm, whether they're able to process it and recover the material fully. So it's really important to sort of work across the value chain when you're considering recycled materials.
That's well said. Remco, in the last minute or so, any big lessons learned from dealing with the recycling industry?
Sure, yes. Indeed, I want to echo that recycling is, of course, preferred from an environmental perspective, but you need to take into consideration the quality or product efforts that you need. And some of the things that we've learned, for example, when we were diving into supply chains of recycled materials, is that these supply chains also may have their own challenges, social or environmental challenges that you need to address. For example, we've dove into the recycled tin supply chain in China, where we actually learned that a lot of the tin is recycled in an informal manner, in a really small scale, that is actually very toxic for the person who is recycling it, as well as the community around it. So yes, using recycled materials definitely is a good thing, but you have to also look into the supply chain and do due diligence and figure out the social and environmental impact associated with those supply chains.
It's a great point, Remco. Thanks. This is unfortunately all the time we have, so we'll have to wrap up. First, I want to thank Shelley for presenting and thank her for answering questions in the chat. I very much appreciate it, and please reach out to her through the platform if you have any follow-up questions. We had some questions as to why Remco and Jordan were just sitting on the side. Well, they're presenting next in the follow-up session, or the kind of joint session here for circular electronics designing out waste. So we'll close this room and open up that session. And they'll present case studies in that space. And Shelley will also be joining us on the panel there. So we'll continue to have kind of this great brain trust with us. But thanks everyone for attending. Hope to see you in the next session. And if not, I'll see you throughout the rest of Circularity 20. Thanks everyone.